Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Historical Fiction, Day 1. And as the title might suggest, we're going to be looking at historical fiction. A couple of weeks ago, we worked with realistic fiction. And up next, last week, we talked about inferencing. And this week, we're going to talk about historical fiction. So, learning targets. You'll demonstrate prior knowledge about historical fiction by answering genre-specific questions. You will discuss and analyze the arrest of Susan B. Anthony, and that is going to be like an article. And finally, you will build academic oral language and vocabulary. Now, one of the things that, because we moved to a video, that we kind of lose out on is we do lose out a little bit of the discussion that we are having. So it's very important that you are paying attention and that you are taking part and pausing the videos and thinking and answering and asking questions and answering the questions as kind of you normally would if you were working with Mr. Winkleman. Which you are working with Winkleman, only you're just working with him differently. All right, so those are our learning targets. I don't know where that came from. Let's look at this, your first page in your handout packet. Okay, what is historical fiction? Okay, and so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to answer these 4 questions here. What is historical fiction? What is the purpose of historical fiction? How do you read historical fiction? And then who writes historical fiction? So please pause the video right now and just answer the questions to the best of your ability. Don't worry if you get it right or wrong. What we're looking for is we're looking for a starting point, because that's what we do every time. We have to start somewhere. And our goal then is to improve your knowledge from where you begin. So pause the video, and then when you're done, restart the video. All right, 5th graders, hopefully you took some time and you really thought about these 4 questions. What is historical fiction? What is the purpose of historical fiction? How do you read historical fiction? And then who writes historical fiction? Because the next 4 slides, or the next 4 parts of this, is we're going to discuss the answers to these questions. And hopefully your questions are somewhat related to where we are. Okay, the first one is what is historical fiction? Historical fiction stories take place in the past. Duh. I mean, history. It means in the past. Settings and events are based on facts. The character can be based on real people or made up. Dialogue is made up because we don't necessarily have anyone who's been there recording things. And if it is exact dialogue, generally that moves into kind of that biography piece. But the information about the time period must be authentic or factually accurate, which means we can't have someone, in the Wild West, in the 1840s, talking on a cell phone. We can't have someone in the 1700s driving around in a minivan. Just think, it has to be accurate for the time period. And oftentimes movies, when we think about movies, a lot of movies are what would be considered historical fiction. So they take place in a certain time period. So the people who are in it, they're wearing certain outfits and they talk a certain way and they travel a certain way. So it's very important that historical fiction, when we think about it, that it takes place in the past and everything matches what that time frame would be. Now, when we talk about what is the purpose of historical fiction, we're talking about a genre that blends history and fiction. The stories allow the readers to connect with the past and learn details about specific eras in time, whether it be the Revolutionary War or, the Great Depression or the suffragette movement, the Civil War, all of these things. And what you find is that readers may also discover that people's problems and feelings have not changed that much over time. The problems become more sophisticated because they build and there's so many more levels and layers. But the same kind of human emotion and the same human decision making that kind of brings people to certain problems and to certain levels, that it existed throughout time. And we see those, and we see the person versus person problem, or the person versus nature problem, or the person versus himself or herself problem. And those things have existed throughout time, and those things never change. And those things, well, we're talking about historical fiction. If we talk about, I guess, future fiction or science fiction, those same problems are going to exist. Now, how do you read historical fiction? Well, the easy answer is left to right, top to bottom. But more importantly, we start for a very specific answer is the title gives you a clue about an important time, place, character, situation. As you read, note how the characters' lives are the same and different from people's lives today. So as we're reading, we should be making connections to what we know. And that's something we talked about with inferencing as well, is that you read and then you kind of bring your background knowledge and you kind of make connections. Okay, note the main character's thoughts, feelings, and actions. Ask yourselves questions to help you better understand the time period. And we have talked about asking questions and coming up with and inferencing and coming up with things about what something might mean, or filling in, reading between the lines. And sometimes those inferences work out, but sometimes they don't. But it's that active engagement of your mind that happens. The book Snow Treasure is a historical fiction, okay, and it's talking about a location in Norway during a specific era, World War II, and the Nazi invasion of Norway. And it's very important that we start thinking, when we look at the main character, Peter's thoughts, feelings, and actions. And what is he doing that you would do or that you wouldn't do? And finally, who writes historical fiction? Well, authors who write historical fiction want to help readers understand what life was like in the past. So the writer of Snow Treasure wants people to think about what life was like in Norway during, World War II. We're gonna be reading an article about Susan B. Anthony, and the author kind of paints a picture in terms of the setting and the various information that the author gives that talks about the setting. Is it historically accurate? And they talk about the main character's point of view, and it's very important that we kind of make that the author is trying to give some information about something, and as a reader we have to try and figure out what that information is. So now let's look at these circles here. When we look at the features of historical fiction, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward here, and then when we look at it, I want you to think of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 circles here. And I want you to, when I'm done talking and I say pause the video and see what you can come up when we think of the features of historical fiction. So when we think of what are the characters like in historical fiction? What are the events like in historical fiction? How about the problem in historical fiction? What is the narrator like in historical fiction? Who is the narrator? The dialogue? What's that like? And then what is the setting? What is the setting like in historical fiction? So when we look at features, we're going to try and generalize amongst all the historical fictions that you have read or that you have come across, and see what you can do in terms of answering these questions. What are the features? Because when you're done, you're going to start the video again, and you're going to see kind of what the book says about features of historical fiction. So please pause and check and see what you do. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's move forward and check and see in terms of where we are. Okay, so when we look at the characters, and we'll just go around in a circle here, because we talked about characters, events, problem, narrator, dialogue, and setting. The character lived or could have lived in the time and place portrayed, okay? Which means we can't put someone who's a modern person and says, speaks and says hashtag cool or whatever in the 1700s, okay? The event occurred or could have occurred in the setting as we move around here. So making sure that it's accurate, Okay, something could have happened. We can't talk about fixing a car in the prehistoric age. Okay, prehistoric is probably not a good idea because there's not a lot of people hanging out there. But we can't talk about it in the, when we're talking about World War, not World War, but when we're talking about, the Holy Roman Empire. When we talk about characters, at least one character deals with a conflict. Conflict with self, conflict with someone else, or conflict with nature. Okay, the narrator is generally a first person or third person point of view. The dialogue is made up, but maybe based on letters, a diary, or a report. So it's going to be similar to kind of how people would speak at that time, and sometimes they draw from other resources in terms of figuring out how people speak. And finally, when we talk about the setting, the story takes place in an authentic historical setting. It doesn't take place in some place made up or some place that, if I'm going to write a story about the 1800s, I'm not going to include the Mall of America because the Mall of America didn't exist. I'm not going to include, Disney World or things like that. But if I'm writing a story after the 1950s, then I can include Disneyland if that's where my story, or if I want to write a historical fiction about a pretend trip I took when I was a child, I can think about what was around when I was a child. Okay. All right. Now, when we go forward here, the next slide is about the arrest of Susan B. Anthony. Okay, and as we go through, I want you to look at how these connect here with these points here. We talk about the character, events, problem, narrator, dialogue, and setting. Now, unfortunately, I didn't block these, and I probably should have. But when you read this, think about those characteristics of historical fiction. So here we go. The arrest of Susan B. Anthony. The deputy marshal of Rochester, New York, stood in the family parlor and asked to see Susan B. Anthony. 10-year-old Clara Stafford watched as he arrested her aunt. 4 days earlier, Clara had listened, proud and shocked, when Aunt Susan said she had just cast her ballot in the election of 1872. Some of Clara's other aunts had voted with Susan. It made no sense to the Anthony family that men and women did not have equal rights, but according to the law, women did not have the right to vote. Aunt Susan's vote was illegal. Aunt Susan and the other women who belonged to the suffragette movement believed the law needed to change. Nothing in the Constitution, they insisted, denied them the right to vote. Clara often heard her aunt speak about the need for women's rights. She was thrilled to have such a passionate aunt. She knew it was important for her own future, but right now, Clara was frightened. Aunt Susan was very calm. She smiled at Clara and said she would be back soon. Cautious, careful people, she said, can never bring about a reform. When news of her arrest spread, she added, it would help the advance of the suffragist cause. She kissed her niece and left the house. Clara hoped that someday she could be half as brave as her strong-minded, dedicated aunt. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you could, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to underline or highlight and draw an arrow to where the setting of the story and the point of view, and see if you can isolate and identify this important information that we talked about in this slide, okay, and this slide, and identify that within this article. All right, and that's all we have for today. Why don't you, if you can, I want you to read this article again, and I want you to identify again once this information. All right, but that's all, and we'll talk to you in a bit.